The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the pine forest and battering against the wooden walls of Elias Moore's cabin. Snow whipped across the window panes, blurring everything beyond into a shifting white void. Inside, the fire in the old stone hearth struggled to stay alive, its glow flickering over the man's rugged face. Elias's breath came in sharp clouds as he forced the door shut, the hinges groaning under the weight of the storm. He had spent decades surviving Montana winters, but this one felt different, angrier, heavier, almost alive. Then, from somewhere in the storm, a sound pierced through the wind. Not the creak of branches, not the cry of an elk. It was a whimper, faint, desperate, human in its pain. He froze. Someone, or something, was out there. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Elias Moore had lived alone in the mountains for 15 years. Once a forest ranger, he had spent most of his life protecting others from the dangers of this wilderness. Now, at 65, he lived in quiet exile, guarding only the silence that filled his cabin. His wife and daughter had been taken by an avalanche long ago, and since then, the mountain had been both his refuge and his punishment. That night, the blizzard showed no mercy. Snow piled high against the door, muffling every sound except the relentless wind. Elias threw another log into the fire, its sparks climbing toward the blackened rafters. He thought of the sound he'd heard earlier, a cry so soft it could have been a trick of the wind. But something in his gut told him it wasn't. He slipped on his heavy coat, pulled the hood over his gray hair, and unlatched the door. The instant he opened it, a blast of cold air punched through the cabin, nearly blowing out the fire. Snow swirled in furious circles, stinging his skin. He stepped out, holding his lantern high, scanning the darkness. "Hello?" His voice was lost in the storm. "Is anyone there?" Then he saw them, two small shapes at the edge of the porch, half buried in snow. When he stepped closer, his heart clenched. They were dogs, two young German shepherds, trembling, their fur frozen stiff. Their eyes, wide and glassy, met his as if pleading for help. "Oh, Lord," he muttered, crouching beside them. One gave a faint whine, the other tried to lift its head but couldn't. Without thinking, Elias scooped them into his arms. Their bodies were icy, limp. He could feel their tiny hearts fluttering weakly against his chest. Inside, he placed them near the fire, wrapping them in his old wool blanket. Their paws twitched as the heat touched them, their breathing shallow but steadying. Elias poured warm water into a bowl, then added bits of jerky he'd saved from his last hunt. "Easy now," he whispered. "You're safe here." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling. The dogs ate slowly, their tails twitching weakly. Elias sat beside them, the glow of the fire softening the hard lines of his face. The warmth filled the cabin again, not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence of life. As he watched them, something stirred deep inside him. It had been years since he'd shared his home with another living soul. The loneliness that had wrapped around him like a second skin began to loosen, just a little. He named them without meaning to. Ranger for the one with the sharper eyes. Blaze for the one whose fur caught the firelight like gold. They curled together, asleep before the flames, their sides rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Outside, the blizzard roared on. Elias leaned back in his chair, listening to the storm's fury. He knew the mountain well enough to understand that nothing happened here by chance. The forest had a way of giving what was needed and taking what was not. But as the night deepened, something shifted. The dogs began to stir. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked. Blaze growled softly, staring at the door. Elias frowned. "What is it, boy?" The wind had quieted, but the dogs stayed alert, muscles tense. Their gaze never left the door. Elias slowly reached for his rifle, a habit he'd never lost. The silence outside felt wrong, too complete, too heavy. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. Then, suddenly, both dogs barked sharply, their voices echoing through the small cabin. Elias's pulse quickened. He went to the window, wiped the frost away with his sleeve, and peered out. Nothing but darkness and snow. He turned back toward the dogs. They had stopped barking, but were still staring, bodies rigid, as if waiting for something. Elias set the rifle by the door, his instincts prickling with unease. "All right," he murmured, trying to calm them. "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it come morning." But deep down, he knew the mountain was warning him. He could feel it in the air, the stillness before something breaks. Elias settled back into his chair, the firelight flickering across his worn face. The dogs lay beside him, their ears twitching even in sleep. The storm began to ease outside, but peace didn't return with it. Something was coming, and before dawn, it would find them. Dawn crept slowly over the mountains, pale and uncertain after the fury of the night before. The wind had finally died, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against the windows. Elias Moore stirred in his chair, his back aching, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The two dogs lay curled together on the rug, their breaths deep and even. For a moment, he thought the night's fear had passed with the storm. But the uneasy feeling that had haunted him still lingered, low and steady in his chest. He rose stiffly, opened the door, and stepped out into a world buried under white. The snow reached nearly to his knees. His cabin sat alone, swallowed by the mountain's vastness. The air was sharp, clean, and so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. He looked toward the tree line. Something in the distance caught his eye. A faint trail led down the slope, half covered by snow but fresh enough to glint under the morning sun. Bootprints, wide and deep, not animal tracks. Someone had been there last night. Elias tightened his coat and followed the prints a few steps, his breath rising in clouds. They led away from the cabin, weaving toward the frozen creek that marked the edge of his land. He stopped there, studying them. Too far from any hiking route, too deliberate to be a lost traveler. His instincts as a ranger stirred awake. Someone had been out here during the storm, and whoever it was hadn't come back. A sharp bark snapped him out of his thoughts. Ranger stood in the doorway, fur bristling, eyes locked on the same direction. Blaze followed, whining low. Elias returned to the porch, uneasy. "You two sure know how to pick a night to show up," he muttered, scratching Ranger behind the ear. The dog leaned into his touch but kept his gaze fixed on the woods, alert. Elias could almost feel their tension. Trained, disciplined, too aware for strays. Back inside, he stoked the fire and poured himself black coffee from the tin pot. The dogs hovered near him, restless. Every small sound, the creak of wood, the hiss of the fire, made them twitch. When the crackle of static broke through the silence, it took Elias a second to realize it was his old CB radio, sitting dusty on the shelf. He hadn't turned it on in months. Now it came alive with faint voices. "Repeat, lost contact north of Bridger Peak. Units continue search. Possible K9 separated during pursuit." Over Elias froze. K9S. His eyes drifted to the two shepherds by the fire. The transmission faded, replaced by static again. He walked slowly to the set, lifted the receiver. But before he could respond, a knock rattled the door, loud and urgent. He reached for his rifle on instinct. The dogs barked furiously, their voices filling the cabin. Through the window, he saw a figure trudging through the snow, bundled in dark winter gear. The person raised a hand and shouted over the wind, "Sheriff's Department!" "Is anyone inside?" Elias hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The woman outside pulled down her scarf, revealing a flushed, determined face. Snow dusted her brown hair. "Deputy Sarah Collins," she said, flashing a badge. "Sorry to startle you, sir. We're looking for 2 missing K-9 units. They vanished in the storm last night." Elias stepped aside, heart pounding. "I think you found them." Sarah entered, shaking snow from her coat. When her gaze fell on the 2 dogs, her shoulders sagged in relief. "Ranger! Blaze!" she exclaimed. Both animals bounded to her, tails wagging furiously. She knelt to hug them, her voice trembling. "Good boys. You made it." Elias watched silently, something tightening in his chest. It was clear now. They weren't strays. They were professionals, trained and disciplined, just like the instincts he'd noticed. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes grateful but serious. "You saved them, Mr. Moore." "Elias Moore," he said softly. "They showed up here during the storm." Nearly frozen, Sarah nodded, glancing around the cabin. "You have no idea how lucky they are. We were tracking a fugitive last night, a suspect armed and dangerous. He fled into the mountains when the weather hit. Ranger and Blaze chased him, but the storm cut off visibility. We lost all signals." Elias frowned, memories stirring of last night's sound outside. "You think he's still out there?" Her expression darkened. "We haven't caught him yet. My team's searching the valley, but with the storm—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "We found tire marks near the base road. Looked like someone tried to make camp. Could be he didn't get far." Elias poured her a mug of coffee and handed it over. "You'll need this, Deputy." "Thank you." She smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes softening. "You live up here alone?" He nodded. 15 years now. The mountain keeps me company." He paused. "Most days, anyway." Sarah studied him, perhaps recognizing something familiar in his solitude. "You must have seen plenty of storms." "Too many," he replied. "But I've never had company quite like this." He nodded toward the dogs, who were now lying by the fire again, content. They seemed on edge last night, like they were guarding something. "They were trained for it," she said quietly. "They don't rest easy when danger's near." As if on cue, Ranger's head snapped up, ears pricked. Blaze growled low, staring toward the window. Sarah's hand went instinctively to her holster. Elias moved closer to the window, brushing aside the frost. Nothing but trees and snow. Still, the forest looked darker than before, as if holding its breath. "You felt that?" she murmured. Elias nodded. "This mountain doesn't go quiet without reason." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled. The dogs stood rigid. Somewhere far off, a crow cried once. Then silence again. Sarah set her mug down and checked her radio. Only static. "My team should have reached this ridge by now," she said. "We're too cut off. The storm knocked out most of our signal repeaters." "You can stay here till it's clear," Elias said. "It's safer than wandering in that mess." "Appreciate that." She gave him a grateful nod. "Once visibility's better, we'll move down to base. For now, I just need these 2 to rest." Elias crouched near the dogs again. Their eyes followed him, calm but watchful. He could feel it, the loyalty in their gaze, the intelligence behind it. These weren't just working animals. They were partners, soldiers. He reached out to scratch Blaze's head. Guess the mountain decided to send me a couple of heroes last night. Sarah smiled, but there was worry behind it. Let's hope they didn't bring any ghosts with them. Outside, the clouds began to move again, shadows shifting over the snow. The light dimmed. Somewhere deep in the trees, a sound echoed, something heavy, deliberate, trudging through the drifts. Ranger stood, barked once, sharp and loud. Blaze followed, hackles raised. Elias met Sarah's eyes. She drew her gun, moving toward the door. "Stay back," she whispered. He reached for his rifle, his heart thudding in his chest. The dogs pressed forward, ready, their muscles taut. The sound came again, closer this time, crunching snow, followed by the faint glint of movement between the trees. Then silence, complete, cold silence. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Whoever it is," she said under her breath, "they're not just passing through." Elias didn't answer. He only looked at the dogs. Ranger's gaze locked on the woods, Blaze's growl deepening, and felt the weight of something unseen pressing against the cabin walls. The storm had ended, but danger hadn't. It was still out there, waiting for night to fall again. The morning light had grown thin and gray, filtered through a low ceiling of clouds. The world outside Elias's cabin was silent, except for the groan of settling snow and the soft click of Ranger's claws against the wooden floor. Sarah stood by the window, one hand on the curtain, scanning the line of trees. Her breath fogged the cold glass. She hadn't slept. Neither had Elias. The dogs had stayed restless all night, growling at every gust of wind, their instincts sharper than human fear. "Nothing yet," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "But he's out there. I can feel it." Elias poured steaming coffee into 2 tin mugs. His movements were steady, deliberate, like someone who had faced danger before and learned to live alongside it. "You're not wrong." "The mountain keeps no secrets for long," Sarah turned, accepting the coffee. Her eyes, gray like the morning, met his. "You used to be a ranger, didn't you?" He nodded slowly. "A long time ago." "Then you know how people move in weather like this? If he's hiding, he's looking for warmth or cover. Maybe an old cabin, maybe an abandoned mine." Elias took a sip, eyes narrowing toward the frozen ridge outside. "Or he's closer than either of us wants to believe." At that moment, Blaze barked sharply, breaking the quiet. He rushed to the door, nose pressed to the bottom crack. Ranger followed, ears flat, tail stiff. Both dogs began to growl, low and synchronized, 2 living alarms. Sarah set her mug down, her hand already reaching for her gun. Elias moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The first thing he saw was the tree line shifting. A figure stumbled out, half bent under a heavy coat, snow clinging to his legs. He was moving fast, desperate, leaving a jagged trail behind him. Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's him." "How can you tell?" Elias asked. She nodded toward the man's gait. "Because no hiker carries a rifle like that." Before she could move, the man slipped, fell to one knee, then scrambled back up, heading directly toward the cabin. Elias's pulse quickened. "He knows we're here." Sarah motioned for silence. "Get the dogs inside." Stay low, but the dogs had already made their decision. Ranger and Blaze pushed forward, barking furiously. Their bodies quivered, muscles coiled, eyes burning with protective instinct. Sarah positioned herself behind the window frame, weapon raised. The man drew closer, now less than 50 yards away. His hood slipped back, revealing a gaunt, frost-bitten face with wild eyes. He shouted something lost in the wind, then lifted his gun. Elias grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her down as the window exploded in a burst of splinters and snow. The gunshot echoed through the cabin like thunder. Ranger lunged forward, snarling, as Sarah rolled onto one knee and returned fire, her shot cracking through the cold. The man dropped behind a snowbank, silence rushing back like a wave. For several heartbeats, no one moved, the smell of gunpowder mixed with pine and smoke. Elias's voice was rough. "You hit him?" Sarah shook her head, crouched by the broken window. "No, he's still moving." She tapped her radio, nothing but static. "The repeater's still down. We're on our own." Elias stood, grabbed his coat and rifle. "Then we make it count." Sarah turned sharply. "You can't go out there alone. You don't even have backup, neither do you." His eyes met hers, steady and calm despite the chaos. "I've hunted these slopes my whole life. You'll need me if he circles back outside." The wind carried the faint crunch of boots in snow. The fugitive was retreating, moving deeper into the trees. Ranger growled, ready to chase. Blaze pawed at the door, whining impatiently. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we stay together." They stepped out into the cold. The dogs led the way, noses low, following the trail of blood the man had left in his wake. The forest loomed silent, its trees heavy with snow, branches sagging like tired arms. The air was brittle enough to sting their lungs. Every breath sounded too loud. Elias moved with a hunter's patience, scanning the ground for signs, broken twigs, disturbed drifts, shadowed prints. The trail led them across the frozen creek, toward a cluster of boulders. There, under an overhang, they found signs of a temporary camp. Ashes buried beneath snow, a torn piece of fabric, and half of a boot print. "He was here last night," Elias said. Sarah crouched beside him. "He's hurt." "Look, blood on the ice." Ranger sniffed the air and barked once, sharp and directional. His head turned toward the deeper woods. Sarah followed his gaze, squinting into the trees. Between the shadows, a faint glimmer of metal flashed. Maybe a gun, maybe just a trick of light. "Stay close," she whispered. They advanced slowly, boots crunching over crusted snow. The forest swallowed sound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Blaze moved ahead, ears high, until suddenly his tail stiffened and he froze. A heartbeat later, a figure lunged out from behind a fallen tree. "Down!" Sarah shouted, firing once. The man's rifle clattered to the ground as he stumbled back, clutching his arm. The dog surged forward, knocking him into the snow. Ranger's teeth locked onto his sleeve, holding firm but controlled, professional. Blaze circled, barking in sharp bursts. Sarah rushed in, kicking the weapon away. The fugitive looked up at her, eyes wild with panic. "Don't shoot! Please, please, I didn't mean to! Hands where I can see them!" she barked, cuffs already in hand. Elias stood back, rifle lowered but ready. The man's breath came out in ragged gasps. He couldn't have been more than 30, though the mountain had aged him years. Sarah secured him quickly, calling out a code through her static-filled radio, hoping the base might pick up a fragment of the signal. Elias knelt beside her, inspecting the wound on the man's arm. Not fatal. "You hit muscle, not bone." She exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders. "Good. The sheriff can deal with him when they get through the pass." They started back toward the cabin, leading the prisoner between them. Ranger and Blaze trotted proudly ahead, tails high. But as they reached the clearing, Elias stopped, his brow furrowed. "Sarah," he said quietly, Look at the ridge. She followed his gaze. Down the slope, tire tracks carved through the snow. Fresh ones. Someone else had been here recently. The realization hit both of them at once. This wasn't his camp, Sarah whispered. He wasn't alone. Before Elias could answer, a distant sound cracked across the valley. A gunshot, faint but unmistakable. The dogs froze, their bodies snapping to alert. Sarah's expression hardened. "Someone's coming," she said. Elias felt the weight of the mountain pressing around them, the kind of silence that always comes before danger. The storm had passed, but the real threat had just begun. They turned toward the cabin, moving quickly through the snow, the captive stumbling between them. The light was fading again, the sky thickening with another wave of clouds. As the wind picked up, Elias glanced at Sarah and spoke under his breath. "You think backup will reach us before night?" She didn't look at him when she answered. "No," she said. "We're on our own." And somewhere above them, on the ridge, another shadow moved. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then thicker, the kind that muffled sound and turned the world into a blur of white. Elias trudged through it with steady determination, the prisoner bound between him and Sarah. The man stumbled often, cursing under his breath, blood soaking through his sleeve. Ranger and Blaze flanked them on either side, silent now but alert, their paws sinking deep into the fresh powder. The cabin came into view, a dim shape through the falling snow. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Elias's fire hadn't died yet. As they approached, the prisoner slowed, glancing over his shoulder. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You're making a mistake." Sarah shoved him forward. "Keep walking." He shook his head, voice cracking. "They'll kill me before sunrise." "You don't know who you're dealing with." Elias frowned. "Who's they?" The man didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the ridge as though he could see something moving there, something neither of them could. Elias felt a prickle crawl up the back of his neck. Sarah pushed the man toward the cabin, scanning the horizon. "Inside," she ordered. Once indoors, Elias stoked the fire and tied the man to one of the cabin's thick support beams. The prisoner winced as he sank to the floor, the light from the flames flickering over his gaunt features. Sarah checked her radio again. Still static. "We need to hold out until the storm clears," she said. "They'll send a rescue team by morning." The man laughed bitterly. "Morning? You think anyone's coming up this mountain?" "Not after what we did." Elias crouched beside him, eyes steady. "What exactly did you do?" The prisoner looked at him, something almost like shame flickering behind his fear. "We weren't supposed to hurt anyone. Just a quick grab, easy cash, no one gets shot. But the boss, he lost it when the dogs showed up, said no witnesses." Sarah's face tightened. "So you're saying there's more of you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "3 left. They'll come for me. Or for you. Doesn't matter which." For a long moment, only the fire crackled. Elias glanced toward the window. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the world in silence. "He's telling the truth," Elias said quietly. "Those tire tracks we saw, there's more than one vehicle." Sarah cursed under her breath. "We can't move him through this weather, and we can't stay put if they're tracking him." Elias nodded slowly, mind working. The old ranger station. 2 miles east, on the ridge. It's got reinforced walls, radio equipment, and a backup generator. If we can reach it before nightfall, we might get a signal out. Sarah looked toward the window, then at the prisoner. "We move at dusk, less visibility." The man shook his head violently. "You won't make it. They've got night scopes. Sarah ignored him, pacing near the fire. Ranger and Blaze followed her movement, eyes sharp. The dogs seemed to understand the tension. They'd stopped panting, ears twitching every few seconds toward the door. Elias sat back in his chair, cleaning his rifle. If they come before we leave, we fight. Simple as that. Sarah gave him a quick look. You really think you can hold them off? He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. Ma'am, I spent half my life tracking poachers and the other half running from grief. I'm too old to be scared now. The prisoner looked between them, shaking his head. You don't get it. They're not amateurs. These guys are ex-military, mercs, maybe worse. If they want me dead, they'll burn this place down to make sure it happens. Sarah leaned close. Then I suggest you start praying they get lost in the snow. The hours dragged by. The storm thickened until it was impossible to tell night from day. Elias checked his watch. It was only 5 in the afternoon, but the sky was already sinking into darkness. The dogs started pacing again, restless. Then, faintly, over the wind, came a sound that made them all freeze. The deep, guttural rumble of an engine. Sarah's hand went to her holster. That's not the rescue team. Elias moved to the window, pulled back the curtain a fraction. Headlights flickered through the trees, cutting pale tunnels of light into the snow. The sound grew louder, then stopped. Somewhere beyond the tree line, doors slammed shut. Voices. They're here, Elias whispered. The prisoner's face went white. God help us. Sarah motioned toward the back room. Elias, get the dogs in position. I'll cover the front. He nodded, whistling softly. Ranger and Blaze instantly fell into formation. Ranger crouching near the door, Blaze slipping behind a table leg for cover. Elias crouched beside the back window, rifle ready. His heartbeat was steady, his breath controlled. Years of training had returned like muscle memory. Snow crunched outside. Someone moved carefully along the porch, testing the boards. Another voice murmured, low, professional. Elias could barely make out the words. 2 inside, maybe more. Wait for my signal, Sarah mouthed silently. 3 of them. Then a crash shattered the silence. A burst of splinters as the door flew open. A man in a black jacket lunged through, gun raised. Sarah fired first. He went down before his shot left the barrel. The dogs barked furiously, the sound filling every corner of the cabin. Another figure appeared at the window. Elias fired once, the recoil shaking through his shoulder. The man dropped into the snow outside. But a third voice shouted from the darkness, followed by bullets tearing through the cabin wall. Wood splintered, glass exploded, the air thick with smoke and powder. Down! Sarah shouted. She ducked behind the table, reloading with quick, precise movements. Elias shifted his aim toward the door again, firing 2 rounds. Ranger lunged forward, knocking over a chair, snarling toward the open doorway. Blaze followed, his bark deep and commanding. Then, silence. Just the hiss of the wind through the broken window. Sarah waited, breath ragged. You think that's all of them? Elias shook his head slowly. Not a chance. He moved to the fallen man near the threshold. The attacker's radio crackled faintly, still clipped to his vest. A voice came through, distorted by static. Team 1, report. Do you have the target? Sarah leaned close, lowering her voice. They're not done yet. There's another group. Elias turned to her, face grim. Then we can't stay here. We move now, they packed quickly. Ammo, food, blankets. Sarah untied the prisoner but kept him cuffed, forcing him to his feet. You're coming with us? He hesitated, fear twisting his face. "You'll get us all killed." Elias grabbed his coat and rifle. "We'll take our chances." Outside, the snow glowed under the faint moonlight, blue and endless. The mountains stretched before them, silent, deceptive, and alive with danger. The dogs led the way, their shapes ghost-like in the falling snow. Sarah followed close, every step sinking deep. Behind them, the cabin stood still for a moment, firelight flickering through the cracks. Then, in the distance, another set of headlights appeared, slow, methodical, climbing the ridge. Elias didn't look back. He didn't have to. He already knew what waited for them before dawn. Somewhere ahead, hidden by trees and ice, the old ranger station stood, their last chance. And if they didn't reach it by nightfall, none of them would survive to see the sun again. The wind screamed across the ridge as Elias led the group up the frozen slope. The storm had settled into a steady curtain of snow, erasing the path behind them. Each step sank deep into the drifts, every breath burning like fire in their lungs. Sarah kept close behind, one hand on her pistol, the other gripping the prisoner's arm to keep him moving. The dogs ranged ahead, their dark shapes cutting through the white. "Keep going," Elias shouted over the wind. "The station's less than a mile." The prisoner stumbled again, falling to his knees. "You'll never make it," he gasped. "They know this mountain better than you." "They'll catch up before sunrise." Sarah yanked him up by the collar. "Then we'd better move faster." Elias's flashlight cut through the dark, its beam flickering as the batteries weakened. The forest thickened around them, black pines leaning close like silent witnesses. Every sound, the creak of branches, the crunch of snow, felt amplified. Ranger suddenly stopped, head high, ears pricked. Blaze stiffened beside him. Elias froze. "Something's wrong." Sarah lifted her weapon. "What do you see?" The dogs didn't bark. They just stared toward the trees. Elias's pulse quickened. He knew that look. He'd seen it years ago when a mountain lion stalked his patrol. That same stillness before violence. Then came the echo. A faint click, mechanical, deliberate. A safety being released. "Down!" Elias shouted. Gunfire exploded from the darkness. Bullets ripped through branches. Snow burst into clouds of powder. Elias dropped flat, pulling Sarah with him. The prisoner screamed as a round grazed his shoulder. Ranger lunged forward, barking furiously, while Blaze darted to Elias's side, growling deep and low. "Return fire!" Sarah yelled, already firing into the flashes between the trees. Elias steadied his rifle, took aim at the muzzle flare, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. A cry rang out from the woods, then silence. "They're trying to pin us down," Sarah shouted. "We can't stay exposed." Elias nodded, scanning the ridge ahead. A faint shape loomed through the storm, the outline of the old ranger station, half buried in snow. "Go! Move!" They broke into a run, boots slipping on the icy ground. The dogs ran ahead, leading the charge. The prisoner stumbled behind, cursing, but fear drove him faster than strength. Another burst of gunfire tore through the night, splintering the trees beside them. Elias fired back without slowing. "Cover the left flank." Sarah turned, shooting into the dark. "Go, go!" They reached the station door, Elias slamming his shoulder against it until the frozen hinges gave way. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and old smoke. Sarah dragged the prisoner in and kicked the door shut, jamming a chair under the handle. The dogs burst through next, panting, shaking snow from their coats. Elias collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. "Everyone alive?" "Barely," Sarah said, Her hands trembled as she reloaded. You. I've had worse mornings. The prisoner groaned, clutching his bleeding arm. They won't stop. You killed 2 of them already. They'll come for you next. Elias stared at him. Then they'd better hurry. I'm running out of patience. Sarah found an old lantern on the counter and lit it. The glow filled the small cabin, maps still pinned to the walls, radio equipment covered in dust. Elias brushed the snow off a console and flipped a few switches. The machine buzzed faintly, static crackling through the speaker. It still works, he said. Power's weak, but if we boost it. Sarah moved beside him, adjusting dials. Maybe we can reach the county sheriff. They worked quickly, tuning through bands of white noise. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, Copy. This is Sheriff Reed. Repeat. Who is transmitting from Bridger Ridge? Sarah's eyes widened. This is Deputy Collins. We're pinned down at the old ranger station. Multiple armed suspects, at least 3 confirmed hostiles, requesting immediate backup. The signal wavered. Copy, snow blocking access, hold position until sunrise. Then static swallowed the rest. Sarah leaned back, exhausted. They know where we are. We just have to make it till morning. Elias gave a short laugh. Sunrise is a long way off. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the old windows. The dogs lifted their heads, ears twitching. Blaze growled softly, eyes fixed on the door. Elias moved to the narrow window slit, peering out into the snow. The faint glow of headlights appeared far down the ridge, 2 vehicles inching closer. They're coming, he said quietly. Sarah joined him, jaw set. We hold here. They won't take this place easily. Elias began checking the station's supply cabinets. He found a half-empty box of flares, a few old first aid kits, and a rusted shotgun still loaded. He tossed it to Sarah. If they breach, use that. She caught it, eyes hard. What about you? I'll take the back window. It's narrow, good sightline. The prisoner sat trembling near the fire, his face pale. They'll kill me for talking, he whispered. You should let me go. Sarah turned sharply. You think I'm letting a murderer walk free? I'm not the one who killed that guard, he snapped. It was Marcus, the leader. He doesn't care about money anymore. He wants to bury every witness, including you. Elias stepped closer. Where would he come from? The road or the ridge? The man swallowed. The ridge. He always flanks high ground. Elias's eyes narrowed. Then that's where I'll wait. Sarah started to protest, but the look he gave her silenced her. I know these slopes better than anyone. If I can take out the driver before they reach the clearing, it'll buy us time. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and whistled softly. Ranger trotted to his side, ready. Blaze stayed near Sarah, growling at the window. Elias opened the back door, snow swirling in like a living thing. He turned once before stepping out. Keep the fire low. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't wait. Sarah nodded, voice low. Be careful, Elias. He gave a faint smile. I stopped being careful a long time ago. Then he vanished into the storm, Ranger following at his heels. The forest swallowed them almost immediately. Snow stung his eyes, but he moved with purpose, following the faint hum of the approaching engines. Ranger stopped suddenly, ears twitching. Elias crouched beside him. Through the trees, he could see shapes, 2 men climbing the ridge with flashlights, weapons drawn. He waited, breath slow, heart steady. When one man raised his arm to signal the others, Elias fired. The shot cracked through the night, echoing like thunder. The figure dropped. The second man spun, shouting, but Ranger lunged from the shadows, knocking him off balance. The fight was quick, brutal. When it was over, the only sounds were the wind and Elias's ragged breathing. He looked back toward the station. A flare burst in the sky, red light staining the clouds. A signal. Sarah was in trouble. Elias grabbed his rifle and ran. Ranger followed close behind, snow flying beneath their feet. The sound of gunfire rolled across the ridge, growing louder with every step. When the cabin came into view, Elias saw silhouettes around it. 3 men firing toward the windows. Blaze was inside, barking furiously. Elias dropped to one knee, took aim, and fired. One man fell. The others turned, shouting. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark near his head. He fired again, until the rifle clicked empty. "Sarah!" he shouted over the wind. "Get them out the back!" A single gunshot answered him, sharp and close. Then silence. "Sarah?" No reply. Elias's breath came fast, his pulse hammering. He looked at Ranger, who stood rigid, waiting for command. "We're not done yet, boy," he whispered. Together they moved toward the cabin, into the last stretch of darkness before dawn, where fate, bullets, and redemption waited. Snow blanketed everything in silence again, as if the mountain itself had stopped to listen. The gunfire was gone, leaving only the slow whisper of wind curling around the broken ranger station. Smoke drifted up from the shattered chimney. The air smelled of gunpowder and pine sap and something else. Loss. Elias Moore pushed himself through the snowbank, half crawling, half stumbling toward the cabin. The cold bit deep into his skin, but he barely felt it. His rifle hung empty at his side, his breath ragged clouds in the freezing air. Ranger trotted beside him, limping slightly, his dark fur dusted white. When Elias reached the doorway, he paused. The wooden door had been torn from its hinges, and the snow had crept inside like a tide of ghosts. Inside, the fire had gone out. Everything was shadow. "Sarah?" he called softly, voice hoarse. From somewhere near the back of the room came a weak groan. Elias pushed forward, eyes adjusting to the dim light. Sarah lay slumped against the overturned table, one hand clutching her side, her face pale but alive. Blaze crouched protectively beside her, teeth bared, but his growl turned to a soft whine when he saw Elias. "Still breathing," Sarah whispered, forcing a strained smile. "Guess I owe you one." Elias knelt beside her, quickly tearing a strip from his coat and pressing it against the wound. "Don't talk." "You'll be fine." Her eyes flicked toward the door. "The prisoner?" Elias looked around. The beam where the man had been tied stood empty, the rope frayed. "Gone," he said grimly. "Either ran or got taken." Sarah's breath shuddered. "And the others?" He shook his head. Outside, faint shapes lay half buried in snow. The men who'd attacked them, now still and silent beneath the storm. The mountain had claimed its toll. Sarah leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. "We bought time for the others to reach us. That's what matters." Elias glanced toward the radio on the counter. The static had stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic signal, the sound of life beyond this frozen wilderness. He rose, adjusted the dials, and spoke into the microphone. "This is Elias Moore at Bridger Ridge. The deputy's wounded, hostiles down. We need extraction." The answer came a few seconds later, broken by static but clear enough to warm his chest. "Copy that, Mr. Moore. Hold your position. Rescue team en route. ETA 30 minutes. He let out a slow breath and looked back at Sarah. "They heard us." Her lips curved faintly. About time. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm outside began to fade into a soft flurry. Dawn crept over the peaks, brushing the horizon with a pale gold light. The snow no longer looked cruel. It shimmered like glass, fragile and beautiful. Elias sat by the window, staring at the mountains he'd lived under for half his life. He'd built his solitude here, believing the world had nothing left for him. But now, surrounded by the quiet remnants of a night that could have ended far worse, he felt something stirring again, something long buried under years of silence. Ranger padded over and rested his head on Elias's knee. Blaze joined him, tail thumping once, then curling close to Sarah's leg. "You're good boys," Elias murmured, scratching behind their ears. "You did what heroes do." Sarah opened her eyes, watching him. "You could have left us, you know," she said softly. "No one would have blamed you." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the snow. "I've done enough running for one lifetime." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that comes after a storm, filled with breath and meaning. Elias fed a few dry logs into the hearth, coaxing a flame back to life. Warmth began to seep through the room again. Minutes later, the faint hum of engines echoed down the ridge. Sarah tried to stand, but Elias held her gently. "Easy. Help's here." When the door opened, the morning light poured in. Two uniformed officers stepped through, one of them Sheriff Reed himself. He froze for a moment, taking in the sight of Sarah, the dogs, and the weary man who stood like part of the mountain. "Good God," Reed breathed. "You're alive." "Mostly," Sarah said with a tired laugh. Reed's men moved quickly, bandaging her wound, checking the radio, leading her toward the waiting snowcat outside. The sheriff turned to Elias. "We've been trying to reach this ridge all night. You saved her." And my dogs Elias looked down at Ranger and Blaze. "They saved me first." Reed smiled, clapping a gloved hand on his shoulder. "You ever think about coming back to work more? Men like you don't just fade into the woods." Elias chuckled softly. "These mountains have a way of keeping what they want." Reed nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then at least let me make sure you're not forgotten. Once these boys finish their training, you'll always have an open door at the K-9 division. You're part of their story." Now Elias didn't answer right away. He stepped outside instead, squinting into the dawn. The snow had stopped. The wind was calm. For the first time in years, the world felt wide open again. The rescue team loaded Sarah and the two dogs onto the transport. Ranger whined, pulling against the leash as if not wanting to leave. Blaze barked once, a soft farewell. Elias knelt beside them, his gloved hand resting on their fur. "Go on, boys," he said quietly. "The world needs you more than I do." Ranger pressed his head against his chest for a moment, then stepped away. The dogs climbed aboard, tails wagging faintly, eyes still watching him. As the snowcat started down the ridge, Sarah lifted a hand from the window. "You saved more than lives tonight, Elias," she called. "You saved yourself." He stood there long after they were gone, the cold wind brushing through his hair. The mountain was silent again, but no longer lonely. The sun climbed higher, touching the white peaks with gold. Elias turned back toward the station. The fire still burned inside, small but steady. He added another log, watching the flame catch and grow. For years, he'd believed kindness had no place left in a world that had taken everything from him. But now he understood. Kindness was what made the world worth saving in the first place. He looked once more toward the path the snowcat had taken, then out to the horizon. A smile ghosted across his weathered face. "Guess the mountain gave me a reason to stay," he murmured. Ranger's distant bark echoed faintly down the ridge, a sound carried by the wind, fading into the light. Elias listened until it was gone, the warmth of the fire reflecting in his eyes. And as dawn broke fully over Bridger Peak, Elias Moore, once a man of silence, finally felt at peace. The mountain had taken much from him, but this time it had given something back. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.